just remember, historical thinking still matters. So in this crazy world where we're getting bombarded with information every single day on our phones, and it seems like the world is imploding, just remember that that skill set and that toolkit that you have to be a critical thinker and historical thinker is one of the ways that we navigate our ways out of this crisis.
Hey, Jamal. How are you?
Good, Nira. How are you doing?
Good. I saw that you were exploring space with your kids the last couple of days. I feel like space is a topic in the news as well.
It is apparently. Hold on a second. Let me just make. All right. It is. Apparently, we just sent a bunch of people up into space with Jeff Bezos, and that looked like a lot of fun for the people who are on board. I love outer space because it is like the future. I believe all the Final Frontier stuff. I grew up on Star Trek and Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica. I love all that stuff. So anytime I get to do anything with outer space, I feel like it's the last pure activity we can do, as long as you don't think about the money.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so I shouldn't talk about how absurdly expensive one space minute is for tourism versus, how many student loans could be paid off with that same amount of money if billionaires actually cared to do that. I shouldn't talk about that part.
Well,
Or
look,
the
they can
space
do whatever they
jug.
want to do with their money. They can do whatever they want to do with their money. The question is, how much of that money, should they also have to put into the kitty, right? So we all need to
Oh, yeah, like pay
benefit from.
taxes. Maybe not take
Yeah, just
all
pay
of
your taxes.
pay taxes. Maybe not have the government subsidize most of your innovation, and then you take the profit and call yourself a billionaire, even though the rest of us subsidized it. That there's an idea.
Right.
I do love space. I love all things related to science fiction, but I'm keenly aware of all the dystopian aspects of how many of these stories begin, and how The Martian Chronicles is a classic by Ray Bradbury, and how people get to Mars, but they end up destroying Mars and having to leave that. And then, Earth is a problem already. So kind of feel like we're in
Well,
those weird dystopian phases where space is exciting because the Earth sucks for a lot of people.
yeah, you can't. The problem is, like anything else in life, you can't leave yourself, right? So whatever problems you have in your life, you're just gonna bring them to wherever you go. And so I think what we're seeing is like people going to space, like perhaps they'll go to Mars, and like you said, we'll just dump a bunch of stuff on Mars, and then we can't use that planet either. We gotta go somewhere else.
Or, the idea that you go up into space and you see that this whole world and how tiny it is in the cosmos, and how amazing it is that we get to live here in this moment, and with all these different types of humans and all the things, cultures, languages that we have. And we barely, in the course of an individual lifetime, scratch even the surface of it. This does connect to
Yeah.
something that my kid did this past week, which was they're doing their Civil War unit in school. And because he's going to school in Maryland, they actually do talk about things like slavery. They don't pretend that
What?
slavery vaguely happened, but we should only talk about the fact that we ended it and just keep moving on. And he did that classic exercise of, who is Harriet Tubman, right? What did
Yes.
Harriet Tubman do? She had the Underground Railroad. I feel like that's such a story.
Hmm.
Everybody, if kids know nothing else, or even adults know nothing else, like, oh yeah, Harriet Tubman. Probably why she got nominated to be on the $20 bill, because that's like the one piece of Black American history everybody needs to know. And the Trump
Right.
administration is now trying to get rid of Harriet Tubman from federal registers and from federal listings. Like, there's literally a national park at the site where she was gathering people, and the site where she was enslaved. And they're trying to erase the references to Harriet Tubman.
I mean, look, I'll tell you, obviously, I have African American kids, and even having a conversation with them, I know it's shocking. Having a conversation with them about slavery is tough. I mean, they live in an integrated world. They go to integrated schools. They've got best friends who are of all backgrounds, and literally, I think all backgrounds. And to talk to them about the fact there was a period of time where, you weren't able to drink from the same water fountain as your friend. And there wasn't a time where you could play together or sit in class together. And before that, there was a time where people who look like, those folks used to own people who look like our folks. And, and that wasn't fair. And so you try to talk about fairness and progress and all the things that, make it better. But I imagine if you're in a family where people who look like you used to own people and treat them really badly, and maybe your own family members, that's super tense, and you don't really want to have that conversation. But the truth is, if we don't have the conversation, we could very well end up back there again. And who wants to do that?
I've seen families get uncomfortable with it in public, going to the where Mount Vernon, where George Washington
Yeah.
lived, and they've redesigned the space to acknowledge the enslaved people who lived there and what their experiences were. And in the line to get in there, there's a little white girl behind me and her dad, and she's like, "Well, why did he have slaves? Why did he do that?" And dad's like, "Well, and just ignored it." And I'm kind of standing there thinking, way to miss a teaching moment, right? Like,
Yeah.
way to not deal with anything because it's uncomfortable. Like,
Yeah.
there are so many things that are uncomfortable about life, let alone being, the minority experience in life. Like, it's really uncomfortable to have to tell your child that, yes, not that long ago, because of the way you looked, people had power over you and everything you did. And that's the only reason, is because people decided they wanted to have that power. So we can make better decisions. That's what
Yep.
that is.
And,
Um,
and I think you
and
try to talk to them a little bit about fairness, right? You talk to them
yeah,
at the level that they are.
yeah.
Right. And so, would it be fair if your teacher only gave, recess time to half the class and the other half of class didn't get to go and
Mhm.
she didn't have a reason just because they sat in the wrong spot? Like, no, that's not fair. Right. That's how it is. And so it's our job to make sure things are fair so everybody gets a chance to play the game and all that kind of
And
stuff, I
as
think.
they grow and they evolve, then the conversation, it does. Ours has now evolved a little more too. So okay, but no, but like, what was this doing? Like, why was this even a thing? I said, oh, because
Mm,
people wanted to make money off of what the
right.
opportunity was, and they forced people to do something rather than pay them, because that allowed you to make more money. And in order to do that, you pretend like they're not people. I said, it is very easy as you walk around life to dismiss people who don't look like you as not people. And so I said, that's the lesson that I draw forward with them, is that you need
Yep.
to recognize
Yep.
that that's the piece that can be modernized, is that you could still separate people out and treat them poorly simply because you can and you have the choice to. Did I ever
What's
tell
that
you
part two? Is that part two? It's the power dynamic, right? I think
power? I think it's all,
it's the
and
power
kids
dynamic.
understand power.
Right.
They're all about
Yeah.
playing with power at that age.
Right.
Did I
And it's like,
did I ever tell you
just
the
because
story?
you can make your friends play a game, like doesn't mean you should. Everybody should have a say what game you're gonna play. You can't just take the ball because it's you want to. You have to wait your turn, like all that kind of stuff.
Oh, and then there's always the parent who will defend their kid. The kid, their kid could be a total bully on the field, and
Mm-hmm.
they never did anything wrong. You're like, oh, okay, I see how these people evolve and where they go and how they grow
Oh
up.
yeah. Oh
But
yeah.
literally, like, preschool and elementary school, it's all about power dynamics and understanding the social trade-offs of that. Did I ever tell you what my kid told me about, when he realized about really understanding him being black, his dad being black, and me
Oh,
not being
tell,
black?
tell, tell,
Okay.
tell.
So I'm facing him, um, and my husband is behind him. So I can see my husband's reaction. The kid can't. He goes, Mama, did you know that a long time ago, um, daddy would have been a slave and I would have been a slave? And I said, well, I said, Idris, yeah. I said, did you know that, mama also? Goes, no, because you're white.
Oh.
And my husband, like, I can see his face. He's laughing so hard, so hard. He had to walk out of the room. I said, well, Idris, Mama's parents come from Pakistan, and that place was also colonized, and people got taken from there, and people were also. I said, so I know, Mama, we call people. I said, remember, you're not like a black, like a crayon black, but people
Right.
call that black. Mama's not like a crayon brown, but they call me brown. He goes, yeah, you're not brown, you're peach. Okay, I can't do this right now. Okay, got it. Thanks, kid.
Well, that's right.
So he's gonna walk around telling me,
That's
Zachary, I
the
got a white
story.
mama. I'm like, okay, you got a white mama.
That,
What am I gonna tell you?
that's the story, is trying to teach them about race and talking about color. But they're like, what are you talking about?
Yes.
You're brown. And trying to understand, like, they have a couple of friends who are mixed race, and so they have pretty fair
Mm-hmm.
skin. And they're like, but that person's white. It's like, well, sort of like their the mother's white, but their father's black, so they kind of are both at the same thing. But they were like, well, I don't understand, because there's like they look just like this other teacher who was obviously like white, and so they can't quite make it all, because you know why? Because it doesn't make sense. That's why.
It doesn't. And
It
so
doesn't make sense to you
before
because it doesn't really make sense.
I'm going to bring our guest in just a hot second, but I want to wrap up this version of the story for you, Jamal, which is that I know people will be like, well, then why did you mention it? You're the one creating racism. I'm like, listen, my kid was going to go to kindergarten and hear a bunch of people talk about Black people. I needed my
Mhm.
kid to know that when they refer to Black people, they're referring to him and his dad. Reality,
Right.
right? Like that's the reality. I'm going to bring in a guest who has really spent a lot of time thinking about how we communicate about history, and so I thought it'd be great for this week. Jason Steinhauer, he is the author of History Disrupted. Welcome to Trailblaze, Jason.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Jason, your thesis for the book introduces this idea that because we all go to a place for information, now we just assume that that is the information that is out there. How does that change our understanding of what's happened in our lives and in our own histories?
Yeah, well, I guess the thesis for the book is that basically social media and the web have changed what we know about history, changed what we remember about the past, and that has consequences for us as society. And so I'm very interested in the way that social media shapes our historical memory, our quote unquote collective memory, if we even have a collective memory anymore. And in particular, we have there's a lot of different ways to sort of splice that out and start to think about it. One of the ways is just what types of historical narratives and stories gain traction on social media, and then how does that shape what we think we know about the past? And then the flip side of that is that how do we actually preserve any of the social media content that we're creating today, or any of the general content that we create today, so that future scholars and historians and journalists and activists can actually understand our moment with any clarity. You think about the billions of pieces of content that are created every day online. How much of that is actually preserved? If it's Facebook or TikTok or YouTube, the answer is very, very small, minuscule, in fact. And then, of course, you think about the government side of things. We have a whole infrastructure to preserve the activities of our government, but that's also been under attack lately. So there are huge questions about whether any of the information that we create in this moment will be preserved. And then if it's preserved, how the social media platforms and the web platforms that we use will shape what we think we know about the past.
So, Jason, you're saying that, but weren't we all kind of told anything that happens on the internet lives forever? Right. And as someone who's bumped up against the internet, coming back to bite you after years later, like doesn't that is that not true?
Well, I would say to you and to all the listeners, go to Wikipedia and check the links at the bottom and see how many of them are still active. You'll find a surprising amount are lead to dead links, dead pages, source not found. So it's ironic, right? You have Wikipedia entries that claim to have footnotes and sources. Then you go to those sources and there's nothing there. So I don't have the statistics in front of me. I'm traveling at the moment, but we lose a sizable percentage of information online every single week, every single year. It's a very small percentage that are actually preserved. I used to work at the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress has a very active web archiving program where we tried to preserve aspects of the World Wide Web for future researchers. But even that is a very, very small percentage of what's actually on the web at any given time. So, the web promised us a lot of things when it was created. It promised us democracy, and it promised us a utopian society, and it promised us that information could live forever and everything you'd ever need would be on the web. We should always remember that oftentimes when people are making promises to us that seem too good, they usually are.
Amen, brother. Amen.
Library of Congress is about preservation, stories, history. Is it still true that every book that's published in the United States has a copy in the Library of Congress in some form or another?
So the Library of Congress actually includes the Copyright Office. So the U.S. Copyright Office is inside the Library of Congress. There are also copyright royalty judges at the Library of Congress who make rulings about things like whether AI can be copyrighted. That was a recent decision that they just made. Any book published in the Library of Congress in the United States gets it copyrighted in the United States. A copy of that will pass through the Library of Congress. Now, most of those items will actually stay in the collection. One copy will stay in the collection, but occasionally there are some items that don't. They get dispositioned or they get sent to other places. The library actually has a huge program to send books to prisons across the United States for prisoners. So sometimes there are excess books that get put into that pile and they go off and they're sent to penitentiaries so prisoners can learn and read and
Stop
have
saying
quality of life.
stop saying that. You know that Doge is going to get rid of those books. That program is toast as soon as they hear this podcast. What? We're giving books to prisoners? They're supposed to be sitting in the corner scratching their nails on the walls to create stories.
Well, the good news about the Library of Congress is, one, it's in the legislative branch, so it's actually controlled by Congress. So at the moment, any of these executive orders do not apply. And two, the Library of Congress has huge bipartisan support. It's one of the few things in Washington these days that is appreciated and celebrated on both sides of the aisle. So let's hope that that continues, because it is a gem.
Let's hope.
It's a wonderful archive online. But I mentioned Library of Congress because I also think about National Archives, and then I think about Smithsonian. And these are publicly funded institutions about preserving history, preserving memory, our stories, the narratives we tell about our country. Who gets included in that narrative and who doesn't is so important. And so much, right? Internet is similar in that the access, what rises to prominence and what doesn't, there's all sorts of voices. And if you're not doing that affirmative pull in, a lot of these get missed. The Trump administration, this is the executive order from March, and I want to quote from it, March 27th, restoring truth and sanity to American history, quote, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth. They say that's actually what the problem is. I read that as like, oh, you're telling on yourself. But they say this is the problem. Replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth. And they call what this has been improper, racially divisive, and anti-American. And then they mention the Museum of African American History, Women's History Museum. As somebody who this is where you live, this is your space, what is your reaction to this?
Well, I mean, I think from my personal vantage point, the fuller story we tell of the American past, the better understanding of our country becomes. And for a long time, many stories, as you noted, were left out of the telling of the American past. I mean, if you look at American history books and textbooks and other articles that were written a century ago or even 50 or 60 years ago, there are a large number of voices that are not included. And so what has happened over the past 10 to 15, 20 years is that scholars and activists and journalists and others have been editing in a lot of voices that were previously edited out. And when you edit in additional voices, the story gets more complicated, right? So you're not just seeing it from one perspective, you're seeing it from this perspective or from that perspective. And something that seemed really wonderful at the time to some people could have seemed really terrible to other people at the exact same time. And that makes the story much more difficult to wrap your mind around. And that kind of fuzzies the moral clarity of a particular situation, because you may have seen it in a particular light and said, oh, this had to have been a positive thing for America. But then someone else comes along and said, actually, we were very negatively affected by that, and we don't see it as a positive thing. And actually, if we changed our policy and did it this way, that would be more positive for us. So that's what I think we as historians and scholars and activists and journalists have been doing over the past generation and a half, is trying to edit back in some stories that may have been purposely left out or maybe just weren't even known about to begin with. Some of this was not malicious. It's just the archival record wasn't there. People had to do research to try to find out how people experience particular events and particular moments in time. So I think, this executive order that came out recently has caused a lot of consternation in the history profession. We like to believe that as much as these entities like the National Archives and the Smithsonian do have a sort of political nature to them, that we could largely proceed with our work just based off of the evidence. So whatever the evidence tells us about women's history or African American history or Latin American history, that's the type of research and scholarship that we want to do. And my hope is that that will still be able to continue in some fashion, even despite this executive order and some of the other things that have been happening.
Jason, you said something a minute ago that I think is the crux of the argument. As we sit here looking forward in the 21st century, it's hard to know what's coming, right? No one 35 or 40 years ago could tell you we'd all be walking around with computers in our pockets and be able to, watch movies. I had my kids over the weekend driving back and forth between Washington, D.C. and New York. And we were, they were both on iPads watching separate movies all the way down, just chomping up bandwidth. But, no one would have known that. So as we look forward with our kids, it's hard to know what's going to be happening in the course of their lifetime. And so it just seems to me we want to make sure they have the best facts or the most facts. I call them the best, not characterize it that way, but they have all the facts that they need and things that they may not think they need today that they may need tomorrow because we can't predict what's going to come. And so it just feels like this effort to sanitize things and to, you know, move books off of shelves or deny areas of study or influence how schools teach those things just feels incredibly short-sighted in a world that none of us can predict is going to happen, and we want our kids to be as equipped as possible to be able to manage the difficulty and complexity.
I think that's a great point. I was actually just thinking about this last night in a slightly different context. So it's Passover right now. And my mother actually sent me a link to Yad Vashem, which is a museum in Israel. And they had photographs of Passover seders that happened in Europe in the late 1930s before the Holocaust. And these are Passover seders that happened in Lithuania and Latvia and Poland. Some of them had Polish Jewish soldiers seated around tables. These guys had fought in the Polish army in the 1920s and 1930s, right?
Yeah.
And I was thinking to myself, looking at these pictures, at the time these pictures were taken, these were so unextraordinary.
That's right.
Because to your point, no one knew what was about to happen 5 years later, where most of the people in these pictures would be killed or murdered, right? And today, because we have these pictures, we actually think of them as extraordinary, right? They have a completely different meaning now than when they were taken, because we know what happened afterwards. So precisely to your point, the record that we keep now, even if it seems ordinary, or even if it seems too expensive, quote unquote, or even if it seems like it may not be that important, we don't know what the future holds. The moments that we're recording now could become extraordinarily important to our children and our grandchildren. And that's why places like the Library of Congress exist. That's why places like the National Archives exist. And that's why there are 21,000 history institutions across the United States that are actively trying to collect material, many of which now face huge funding shortfalls as a result of the closure of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute for Museum and Library Services. So while we may think that we're quote unquote saving money or eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse right now in this moment, think about the cultural heritage and patrimony that we may be losing as a result of this. And does that seem worth the cost of what we're doing now? To me, it doesn't, especially when these agencies are such a minor drop in the overall federal budget.
Oh, that's the thrown data point, right? That if all of the pain that Doge has inflicted, it's been 2% savings, if that. 2% savings on the trillions of dollars that they promised. But the pain and the impact is real. You mentioned in this story, in talking about the pictures and what they mean and how meaning changes over time. And I thought of how perhaps we see ourselves in the past as well. Like, oh, I'm connected. This tradition, Passover tradition, connects me throughout time. And it's an experience that's thousands of years old. That idea of knowing our place in time and history, it's been referred to as a meta-narrative, strikes me that that's actively what the Trump administration and MAGA folks want to do, is they want one meta-narrative about what America is to be the dominant one, even if it means that some of us don't see ourselves in it anymore.
Well, I have to say that if that's the case, that also has a long history. Right? There's been many attempts throughout the American past to try to define a sort of super narrative that everybody falls into. And then many people have gotten left out of that narrative, as we talked about earlier. Today, we live in a social media era where our understanding of the world and our understanding of ourselves is highly, highly fragmented. So if that is what they're attempting to do, I don't even know if that's possible anymore. I mean, there may have been a time where the coercive power of the state was strong enough that through memorials and public schools that you could maybe superimpose a meta-narrative onto a broad swath of society and it could stick. But I think in the social media age, where everything is super fragmented, where we're looking at literally 167 million videos on TikTok every minute of every single day, that type of superstructure is going to be very hard to impose and very hard to keep in place. So I think for me personally, when I think about the 20th century, if I was in a position of, running the Smithsonian or in the White House, I would be trying to embrace that fragmentation. I would be trying to embrace that decentralization. I would be trying to get as many of the 340 million Americans who live in this country to have their stories included in that narrative as possible from as many perspectives as possible, old and young, black, white, everything in between, native, indigenous. To me, that panoply of stories is what America represents. And, we're approaching our 250th anniversary next year. And what I want to see is I want to see all of that diversity reflected in that celebration, commemoration, whatever word you want to call it. I think it's an opportune moment to embrace what has truly made America great, which is immigration, diversity, and a really bold experiment in what it means to give freedom to millions of people at the same time and allow them to pursue their dreams and their hopes and their aspirations. And that's an experiment we're still undergoing. And I would like to see us embrace that. And I hope that maybe there are some people within the circles of power in Washington these days who also agree with that.
You said there were 167 million TikTok videos. That's a lot of cats. I guess that's not what TikTok is anymore. But for those of us of a certain age, right?
Certain age,
we remember,
of which I am not. To clarify, I'm of the dance moves.
How old
TikTok
is
is dancing.
TikTok's only like 10 years old or something. So you don't have to be that old to remember the TikTok cat craze era.
Yeah. Well, that's another one of those episodes in our collective memory that may or may not make it to future scholars.
Right. People will wonder when the cats take over why we worshiping them so early.
You're
Forget
warned.
AI. It's the cats we have to worry about.
Right.
Always.
What surprised you the most when you were writing this book? What did you learn that I always marvel at the point scientists or discoverers make. You go in thinking you're going to have this eureka moment, and every once in a while you get like a, that's interesting. I didn't know, so what was that's interesting moment for you that really surprised you?
Honestly, I think the biggest surprise was to see how much the internet has stayed the same over 20 years. Mm-hmm. We get this perception because of our news cycle and because all these new platforms come out and all these press releases come out touting this new feature or that new feature, that the internet is rapidly changing and, 1 year over the next, it's completely different. But actually, it turned out that the internet was largely the same in the 20 years that I sort of looked at the book, from 2004 over to 2024 or whatever it was. And I say that because, yes, the platforms change, the rise of TikTok, for example, Twitter gets taken over by Elon and becomes X. But ultimately, the underlying dynamics stay largely consistent. Facebook is still largely Facebook. They've made changes under the hood. They now do more stuff with AI as opposed to human content moderation. But overall, many of the dynamics have remained the same in terms of how Facebook operates. What was interesting, how that applied directly to the book is that, in looking at how people have communicated history online in 2004, 2005, and then comparing that to how they communicate history online in 2020 and 2021, it's largely the same tropes, the same mechanisms. It's, just to make it a very concrete example, right? The internet works very well on the conceit of surprise. You have to catch people's attention within the first few seconds in order for them to click on the headline or continue watching the video. So you'll see a lot of history content online that plays into this conceit of surprise. So the surprising facts about history you never knew, or the surprising history that your teachers never taught you. Right. And that's supposed to capture your attention and make you click on the link. Well, that was happening in 2004. It's still happening in 2024. So many of the ways that we communicate history have remained the same online, largely because the platforms are still privileging the same types of content that they did 20 years ago. And the same types of content works well to achieve visibility, which is ultimately what everybody's going for on the web.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying to me is that fads come and go, but snark and beauty secrets last forever.
Oh yeah, let's get into some of the tropes, particularly the tropes that have lasted through our understanding of American history, because you mentioned something about collective memory, if we even have one anymore, or if that is even as a thing. And I'm curious about that, given the internet, given the fact that government websites are disappearing information about, Jackie Robinson, the Native American code talkers, and the Secretary of Defense said, well, diversity is not a strength. Our strength is unity. Right. So it's that's an overt message of what story should or should not get told. And then you talk about the fragmented information space, particularly on the internet. expand on that idea. Like, then where does a collective history or collective memory come from?
Yeah, so let me backtrack a bit. I was recently at a conference in DC where we were talking about living archives and capturing real-time history. And we were talking a lot about 9/11, the 25th anniversary of 9/11 is coming up next year. And of course, 9/11 was a moment where there was lots of real-time documentation of history. We have so many emails from people, messages from people in the towers. We have TV broadcasts, radio broadcasts. Um, and I just sort of made the posed the question to my colleagues without having an answer about whether 9/11 was actually the last sort of collective memory moment that we have. Right? Because if you think after that, right, what is the collective memory around the financial crisis or the collapse of Lehman Brothers? What is the collective memory around the Obama administration or the Trump administration or COVID-19? We don't really have one, at least not yet. Now, you might argue that maybe it's too soon,
But we
but
all
if you look
experience
back,
it, but the memory is different, is what you're saying.
right, well, if you look back in at previous eras, you'll find that the formation of collective memory actually happens very early after the events have already concluded. So it's not a question of time and space. In some ways, I think it's a question of just we have a very different information landscape now, and we also have a very different sort of or um, trust landscape right now. And what I mean by that is that to have a collective memory, you have to have a lot of trust in the civic institutions that perpetuate that memory, whether that be public schools or whether that be public health institutions, or whether that be civic institutions in your community. And if you've read Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, or you've just sort of tracked what's generally happened over the past 15, 20 years, you look at the news cycle that we're currently in, where it's government and civic institutions are seen as the problem and not the solution, it seems then sort of incongruous to believe that those civic institutions can really forge successfully a collective memory if people don't even really trust them. Um, and that's part of what's happening with Doge and this attack on government. It's been this just sort of seed of distrust that has been planted at these institutions for decades that is now coming home to roost. And then you couple that, of course, with our fragmented media landscape, where we're all looking at different channels and watching different social media feeds. And my argument, which is not fully fleshed out at the moment, was that we don't really have collective memory. We have a collection of individualized memories. And so that collection of individualized memories now becomes the way that we try to make sense of these events. And again, if I was running the Smithsonian or the National Archives at the moment, I would be leaning into that. And I would try to collect as many of those individualized memories as possible from social media and from podcasting and from other walks of life and parts of community, and then try to stitch that together into something that would have meaning for people. That to me is still diversity, but it's also strength, because from that diversity, you are creating a stronger picture of what it was to live through these moments. I don't see diversity and unity as being in opposition to each other. I don't see diversity and strength as being in opposition to each other. So that may be one way where I depart from the current administration. But to me, that's how I would go about sort of doing real-time history in this social media age, sort of lean into that fragmentation.
Yeah, so I was a history major in college, and so I just
You
and
too?
I
We never talked about
was
this.
I was.
See, I knew I liked you guys. We're three
I
peas in a pod here.
I thought that I was going to go get a PhD in history. I spent the summer after my like senior year at University of Florida in this PhD pre-program, and yeah, I ended up deciding that I didn't want to spend my life doing that every day, but I did want to. I've always maintained an interest in it, and the thing I remember is right, like journalism. It was like the first take of history, supposedly, right? Newspapers and those collected stories, and then you got kind of the magazine, the end of the week. Back in the old days, you had those weekly magazines, Time and Newsweek, and then you had the the books that were written about it from kind of the period. And so you had this sort of longer lens of we learned more, we put more in, we had more space. So now we've got this precursor, which is the first take, which isn't really journalism. It's like the instant take of people from social media, which is almost like getting snippets of people's. It's not even like maybe, journalism was sometimes, or books were written off of diary entries or letters between people, which were sort of real time takes. This is like the instant moment that someone perceives something and how they perceived it. And then one day, I guess we'll have AI implanted in our brains and they'll be able to tell us how we felt at the end, like the nanosecond moment. But it's the first take, right? It's really the first take.
And I want to jump
Yeah,
on that
listen.
which is one with the idea that, right, that take we don't get out of that dopamine piece to get to the week in review, to then get to the longer term and right and reevaluate and look at these same pieces of information. We're just constantly taking in new info, new info, new info, new info, or maybe even repetition of the same info. So, what is your advice then for people who we're all in this moment trying to wrangle and wrestle with what's happening and what our stories are? How do we do that in a meaningful way that actually accounts for the methods of history and analysis and not just quick takes?
Well, I think part of being, a historian or even taking history courses or being trained in a historian by historians is not just the output, but also the process, right? So the process of doing history is as important as the product of historical inquiry. So we're oftentimes thinking about history as the product, a book, an exhibit, a documentary film, right? But historians also like to think about the process of doing history as important, perhaps even more important than the end product. The process of doing history includes critical examination of sources. And that is one of the key skills that you learn both as a journalist as
Yes.
well as a historian,
Yes.
right? And so a social media post, a news story, a hot take, these are all primary sources that need to be interrogated critically. That's how I view them. That's how historians view them. And that's how I think teachers view them in the classroom as well. And that's how we as information literate media consumers also have to treat them,
If we could
right?
just
And
get all
so,
of our parents and aunties and uncles to stop taking whatever they just learned on Facebook and sending it to the 35 people in their, in their phone books, perpetuating these
Dude.
nonsensical stories. If we could do that, we could probably solve half of America's problems.
well, listen, I will say this. I think part of that is something that is admirable and we should lean into because it shows that people want to learn, right?
So my
People
dad
want,
needs to spend more time on WhatsApp with his old friends? Is what you're saying? Come on.
pe- people want to learn. They want to know things, right? And
Yeah.
they want to know things that other people don't know. There's a feeling that's associated with that. And so we can use that. That's something that we can use to our advantage. That's something that we should tap into and lean into. Learning is a cool thing. And listen, I have a young child right now, and it's amazing how much he loves to learn.
Yeah, it's true.
And so learning is a sort of innate human trait, and I think we need to cultivate that. Part of the way you learn as an adult and as an information literate media consumer is by asking good questions about the material that you see. And in the history world, we talk about reading sources against the grain. So, you might see a letter and you might analyze what's in the letter, but then you also have to read against the grain of the letter and realize what's not in the letter and what's being left out from the letter and why did that person leave that stuff out. And all those skills still apply in a 21st century media environment. They're more difficult because we're ingesting so much information at any given time. And, it's hard to ask people to critically analyze every single TikTok video that they watch. But those skill sets still matter. And so when we're looking at what's happening from the current administration, for example, when these executive orders come out or they post these videos on Instagram that show migrants in chains with their heads being shaved, we need to teach people how to read against the grain of those sources and say, what's really going on here? What have they left out of that video that maybe would be important context? Maybe part of what they left out is the fact that not all these people have been legally detained. Some of them were American citizens who were just taken overnight without due process. They conveniently left that part out of the video, but we as information consumers need to ask that question about what's been left out. And the same is true of the historical information that we see online. You see information online that sort of tries to tease you with this surprise conceit. Oh, the thing about history they never wanted you to know. Yes. Well, okay, let's take a moment and step back from that. First of all, is this a trustworthy source that's telling me this information? Are they trying to get a rouse out of me? Are they trying to lean into that dopamine hit? But also, what are they leaving out? Maybe this actually has been taught in various places. Maybe it was taught a long time ago and was taken out of the curriculum for a particular reason, right? So there's all kinds of questions that we can teach people to ask to read against the grain of the primary sources that they see. And that's part of the work that we try to do and that I've been trying to do since this book came out.
Well, the hard part is something you tapped on earlier, which is everybody wants to be the first person to say, "Hey, did you hear that?" Or "Did you know?" Or "I just found out." Everybody wants to be Paul Revere and tell the story first. So, thank
Yeah,
you.
Which
yeah,
we might not even know that story properly from is what I'm learning right now.
Oh, not even Paul Revere.
exactly.
They're gonna take Paul Revere, the woke
Dang
mob. Okay. Jason, thank you for joining us. This has been a good way to like have a little take a breath and not just get caught in the day-to-day back and forth of the of what's happening right now, but really take a wider lens at it and try to think about who we are and how we make sure we preserve this moment for the future.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. And for the listeners everywhere, just remember, historical thinking still matters. So, in this crazy world where we're getting bombarded with information every single day on our phones, and it seems like the world is imploding, just remember that skill set and that toolkit that you have to be a critical thinker and historical thinker is one of the ways that we navigate our ways out of this crisis.
Thank you,
All right, thanks a
Jason.
lot.